I'm Alastair Kent. For about 25 years, I was the Executive Director of Genetic Alliance UK, which is the umbrella group for patient support organisations for families affected by rare and genetic conditions. I retired from that role a few years ago, but I've continued to engage with the issues of rare diseases, of science policy, of health provision and service development for those affected by the many life-limiting and severe conditions that affect thousands and thousands of families across the UK today. When I started at Genetic Alliance UK many years ago, rare diseases were not really seen as an issue. The key word was rare, which was taken to mean that not many people were affected. It probably meant that not much could be done for those who were affected. And therefore, in the eyes of many, then rare diseases were actually not very important. They weren't a significant issue for the National Health Service. They weren't a key focus for research. Industry was not engaged with the development of innovative therapies for rare diseases. And families were basically in a situation where, although there were a small number of interested clinicians, the services were disjointed, disconnected, and families were very often left feeling isolated and unsure about what had happened to them or to their child, their partner, and how the impact of this condition could be ameliorated. Indeed, in many cases, families didn't even know, they didn't get a diagnosis of what the condition was that was impacting on them. So they couldn't even find others in the same position and find support from them in a sort of peer-to-peer support network. So over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, I want to try and examine how this situation has changed in the last 20 or 30 years, looking at it from the perspective of those affected and those who care for them, the patients, the families, the partners, the loved ones. You know, if you think about it from that perspective, having a rare disease it's not a choice. It's not something that we opt for. It's something that happens to us, often by virtue of an accident of our genetics, although that may be compounded by lifestyle, by environmental factors, by diet, nutrition, and so on. We are members of a club that we didn't choose to join, and it's a club that we actually be very keen to leave. But the only way we can leave is through the application of intelligence and entrepreneurship to the resolution of the problems that affect us by understanding, by investing in research, by developing new ways of intervening, and by recognizing the reality of the situation for patients and families as they experience it day by day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. But over the years, this situation has gradually begun to change. That's not to say that the problems don't exist. Still, the vast majority of rare conditions do not yet have a disease-modifying therapy, but today there is a much greater awareness of the importance of rare diseases, not just to those who are directly affected, but also to the health service, to the wider society, and of the need to engage in high-quality biomedical research and of the translation of the outcomes of that research into interventions that will produce health gain and improve the quality and quantity of life for those affected, and also for those who live with and care for those who are affected. So what's changed? Well, the first big push for change has come through our increasing ability to understand these conditions, these diseases, at the molecular level as a result of scientific progress. We have new ways of investigating what has gone wrong in our bodies, thanks to the application of science. We can now begin to appreciate what precisely has happened in our genes, in our chromosomes, that has precipitated the catastrophic sequence of events that results in a life-limited and inheritable disease. And the lessons that we've learned from our investigation of rare diseases are not confined to that category of conditions. They also have implications for more common diseases, because the more we know about more common diseases, the more we realize that very many of those which on the surface look to be one single condition, in fact, when you delve into them at the molecular level, they are a result of very different changes in our bodies that need to be addressed by specifically targeted therapies in the form of a more personalized approach to the medical treatment of those affected. The other thing that's changed, which is significant, is that there is a growing recognition of the burden of rare diseases, not just for families. I mean, families live with these conditions constantly. They're never able to get away from the impact of their condition on the quality and quantity of life that they're able to enjoy if they're directly affected. But far from rare diseases being rare, although individually any one condition may only impact on a small number of people in the UK, because there are so many rare diseases, at least 7,000 have been identified. They are, in fact, they have a huge impact on the National Health Service, and rare disease patients take up a disproportionate amount of resources. That's not to say they shouldn't be entitled to those resources. Of course they should. But the cost of rare diseases to the health service is substantial. And by bringing together and creating the critical mass that makes the problem visible, it enables a strategic response to be made by health service planners, by clinicians, by service providers. It also makes it more possible, more attractive for the academic community, for industry, for research to be targeted at developing therapies or disease-modifying interventions. And of course, recognition of the scale of the problem, coupled with the advance in scientific understanding, means that we can see ways of intervening today that were not thought to be possible 20 years ago, because our ability to do the science had not progressed to the point at which it was feasible to delve into these conditions. A third factor which has brought about change and increased the recognition of the importance of supporting and caring for those with rare diseases has been political engagement. Politicians of all persuasions have, largely through the activities of patients themselves, of the support groups that exist to help them and to advocate on their behalf, have begun to realize that rare diseases are not an insignificant problem, and that there is a need to create a regulatory, a legislative framework that allows for the expectation of patients and families affected by these conditions to be realized. You know, if you have a rare condition, you know, your hope is that something can be done, and that if something can be done for you, then it will be done for you in a timely, effective and user-friendly and sustainable manner by the health service, which is set up, predicated on the basis of responding to need rather than ability to pay. And the other thing that has come with that political recognition is understanding of the economic cost of rare diseases, not just because of the demands of those affected, but also because very often other family members are unable to work. They're unable to make career progression because they become tied in to a support network that is located in one specific place and that has taken an enormous amount of time, effort and ingenuity to put together. And the fear is that if you move away from that established network, then you won't be able to replicate it elsewhere. Specifically, there have been a number of legislative changes, policy developments that have really pushed the needs of patients and families with rare conditions onto the legislative agenda. A sea change happened in 2000, in the year 2000, when the European Union adopted the orphan medicinal products regulations. Prior to 2000, there had been very few, you could count them on the fingers of one hand, products specifically developed by industry for the modification of any given rare condition. Since 2000, there are now over 200 specifically developed and marketed therapies for rare conditions. And these are coming forward for marketing authorization at a steady rate every year. So how did this happen? Well, in the US, they'd had orphan drug legislation for a number of years. But in Europe, we were behind the times on this. But patient groups working with other stakeholders were lobbying the European Commission, the European Parliament, to create and develop orphan legislation, which was similar in its content to that which prevailed in the United States. And we were successful. That campaign resulted in the adoption of the regulations and the creation of a specialist committee, the European Medicines Agency, the Commission for Orphan Medicinal Products. And uniquely at that time, that committee, the COMP as it's known, included 3 patient representatives as full members of that committee. This was the first time this had happened in a scientific committee at the Medicines Agency. And the patient representatives on that committee had exactly the same rights and responsibilities as the other members of that committee, the representatives of the national competent authorities, the European Commission, and so on. Having patient representatives on the committee actually changed the tone from a traditional regulatory committee where the committee is seen as the guarantor of probity, on behalf of society, the determinant as to whether an innovative medical product is able to meet reasonable standards of quality, safety, and efficacy. That's the final stage before something goes on the market and is potentially available to patients. And it's right that that should be a rigorous and a demanding hurdle to leap. But the COMP, the Orphan Medicinal Products Committee, does its work much earlier in the cycle. And although the committee and the patient representatives on it were absolutely adamant that they were not interested in bad science, they were not interested in things that were biologically unfeasible or implausible, they were determined to try and create a climate where if an idea had legs, shall we say, then we could help it to walk. If an idea had wings, we could help it to fly. There are so many hurdles that an innovative medicine has to leap, both in terms of the complexity of the science of the clinical development program, that we don't want to make those early stages so demanding that potentially successful ideas fall before they have a chance to prove whether or not they are they have the potential to become a disease-modifying therapy. And I think the patient representatives on that committee played a key role in setting that tone for the committee, of striking the balance between supporting aspiration and checking for implausibility. And the membership of the impact of patient representatives on the comp has subsequently spread to the other scientific committees of the Medicines Agency. So the patient voice is heard right across the spectrum, not just in the rare disease field, but also in other areas of the Medicines Agency work. And that has, that coupled with the incentives available as a result of the adoption of the regulations, has stimulated a substantial growth of interest on the part of industry, of academia, of clinical medicine, in the coming together in partnerships for the development of novel ways of intervening in a growing number of rare diseases. And indeed, as later on in a few minutes' time, we shall look to the future and see how that might be developed. There were a number of other changes. The European Commission saw that rare diseases were one of the key areas in the health arena where coming together across national boundaries could create added value. No matter how big or the member state was, even the large ones like Germany, the UK, France, and so on, did not have sufficient numbers of patients with any given rare diseases in most cases, to be able to undertake the development, the research and development, the organization of clinical medicine and the provision of support for right across the board on their own. But if you bring the member states of the European Union together, then you're talking about a much bigger population and a much greater opportunity to build the critical mass, to make clinical understanding more rounded and more developed, and to make access to that expertise more equitable to patients and families. So the European Commission set up the Rare Disease Task Force, which over the course of its work expanded to become the expert group on rare diseases, and that produced a recommendation which was adopted by the Council of Ministers that all the member states should produce a national plan or strategy for rare diseases, which outlined how those national health services were going to respond to the needs of rare disease patients for which they were responsible. That Commission communication was published in 2013, and member states were given 4 years to come up with a plan. The UK published its plan, and this was a unique process in our policy making, because health is a devolved responsibility in the UK. It is devolved to the administrations in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. But the rare disease strategy that was published in 2013 was unique in that it was formed by a coming together of the 4 health ministries in the UK, and it presented 51 commitments that the nation undertook to make in order to try and boost the services and support available to those affected. It was a 5-year plan that lasted until 2020. Patient organisations, again, were central to engage in the development and delivery of this strategy. They were represented on the oversight committees in each of the 4 nations. They played a key role in interacting with other stakeholders to make sure that the perspective, the issues that were important to those affected and those who care for them were central to thinking and to developments. This is important because historically, the patient's voice has often been an afterthought. People have made their plans and at the end of the day have turned around to the patient community and said, you do agree with us, don't you? And if the answer was no, then potentially it was too late to change, because the plans had been made, the train had left the station, and the patients were left scrambling after it to try and jump on as it gathered speed. But in the rare disease arena, with the strategy, patient engagement was central to successful delivery right from the start. And it meant that where plans were discussed, we could be confident as patient advocates that to some extent at least, it was not perfect, and nobody would realistically claim that it was a perfect execution of an ideally sorted piece of policy. But to some extent at least, as patient advocates, as patients, we could be confident that we had a voice in helping to focus the attention of those charged with the development and delivery of services, the planning of research and development, that they were concentrating on the things that matter to patients rather than the things that can be measured and counted. Of course, we are dependent on hard, robust data. Nobody would deny the importance of that, but we must make sure that that data that is collected is relevant to the things that matter to patients. We all know when we have an illness that even if it's a relatively minor one, that there are some aspects of that illness that really spoil our day and other aspects of it that we can live with. So if we're going to develop ingenuity and effort to solving the problems of any given disease, it's important that those doing this work are confident that they are focusing on those things that spoil our day rather than the aspects that, yes, they're a nuisance, but we can live with. And the patient voice is now seen as an essential component of policy and practice. Patients are experts in their own right. They have insights into the impact of conditions that others don't have, which are complementary to the insights from clinicians, from other healthcare professionals, from researchers, and so on. Patients are also able to help those planning clinical development and services focus on what is needed, what you need to know, rather than what's nice to know. Because patients actually are very willing to participate in clinical development programs, provided they understand and feel and can see the relevance of the questions being asked to their wish to live a life which has the best possible quality and quantity, given the real limitations that may be imposed by that condition. And patients are also able to help to determine the value of any given intervention in terms of the consequences of the change that it brings about. So it's not just a measurement of a few degrees of change in a joint movement, for example, a slight increase in lung capacity or whatever. It's understanding what can be done in terms of the life of the person affected and of their carers as a result of that maybe sometimes small change in physiological measurement. So, looking to the future, we have the prospect of continued scientific advance, and the hope that this scientific advance will bring benefits for many more patients and families affected by rare diseases. But for that to happen, we need to be confident that this new knowledge that research is generating will translate into health gain. That means we must have a regulatory system that's fit for purpose, with flexibility to respond to new ways of working. And there are encouraging developments on that side. You know, the MHRA and NICE, for example, are working on the Innovative Licensing and Access Program. There's the Innovative Medicines Fund, which will provide dedicated support for innovative medicines, many of which will be for patients with rare diseases, and other steps within the health service, which will hopefully bring about advances. The emergence of integrated care schemes by NHS England will potentially also improve the coordination of care and make geographical inequities across the country a thing of the past. Central to these developments will be partnership from day one. From the moment somebody has a bright idea to the moment a novel therapy is available to patients who need it, between the patient organizations and the other stakeholders. And patients need to be confident that the framework that determines what gets developed, whether things that are developed are then made available in a timely and sustainable manner to those who potentially stand to benefit from them, is robust, it's relevant and fair. The framework must be broad-ranging in terms of what it encapsulates as being parameters for determining value, not just focused on cost. Looking, for example, at wider issues such as the mental health burden on families where there is a child or an adult with a life-limiting rare disease. The societal cost of caring for that person, which may be borne by unpaid carers, parents or partners who may have had to give up work and have lost opportunities. And the social justice element of responding to the aspirations of the health service to be able to meet needs that on the basis of fairness. And this too has implications for the broader healthcare system as personalised medicine in common conditions becomes more increasingly widespread. However, we still have a long way to go. As I said earlier, there's something like 7,000 or more rare diseases. Fewer than 5% of these at the moment have a disease-modifying therapy. The prevalence of rare diseases as a whole means that 1 in 17 of our population, or about 3.5 million people in the UK, are affected by one or other of these conditions. And when the initial rare disease strategy came to an end in 2020, it is now being replaced with a new framework, a new rare disease framework, which has laid out 4 key strategic goals. Improved diagnosis, to reduce the diagnostic odyssey that patients and families with rare diseases experience, going from doctor to doctor, failing to get diagnosed, sometimes getting misdiagnosed. And of course, if you don't diagnose or you misdiagnose a patient, then you potentially deprive that patient of the opportunity to benefit from effective interventions where these exist. With a misdiagnosis, you may end up inadvertently doing harm by giving treatments for a condition the patient doesn't have and which may not benefit them at all. So improved diagnosis, shortening the diagnostic odyssey is the first one. Second one is better coordination of care. Rare diseases are usually complex multi-system disorders, and their effective care depends on the coming together, not just of a variety of different clinical specialties, but also social care, community care, and in the case of children, of education and appropriate provision as well. So that needs to be coordinated, so families are not bouncing around the health service and their local authority, seeing different professionals at different times, all of whom have got a partial take on the issues and who don't effectively communicate with each other to provide a coordinated and comprehensive plan. The third priority is greater awareness of doctors and other healthcare professionals of the existence of rare diseases in their caseload and of the routes to support that need to be created in order to speed the passage of a patient and a family through the system to the point at which the health service can say to them, we know what this is and this is what we can do about it, and here is the plan for your treatment, your support. And fourthly, we need to ensure easier access to patients to disease-modifying interventions in a speedy manner through effective evaluation by NICE, by the other agencies, and through the commissioning processes adopted by NHS England and the health service in the other nations of the UK. At the moment, sometimes it takes a long time, or it can seem to take a long time to patients and families for a novel medicine, once it's given a marketing authorization, to be made available to patients through commissioning and routine prescribing. And if you have somebody who is affected by a rapidly progressive condition, then that can result in potentially avoidable harm being allowed to happen. And for those affected, that is a tragedy. So in concluding, we have come a long way in the last 25 or 30 years. Rare diseases are now seen as being a key priority. The needs of patients and families affected by them is recognized as being a legitimate demand on our health service and on our other services, such that those affected can aspire to as normal a life as possible, as fulfilled a life as possible, given the often very real limitations that their condition imposes on them. So we need to, but there is still obviously a huge way to go. We have a struggle facing us as the country attempts to build back following the COVID-19 pandemic and the disruption to healthcare that has caused. However, the pandemic has also created new ways of working as people have risen to the challenge of providing support for rare disease patients under pandemic conditions. And we must make sure that as we build back the health service such that it is able to deliver a new framework, don't forget the lessons from the pandemic, but we incorporate them into good practice. And that as we deliver on the new framework, we set tangible, measurable outcomes for all key stakeholders and engage in a partnership with patients and families to deliver the objectives that the framework has laid out. And that as patients, as patient organizations, we will continue to hold the feet of those responsible to the fire so that they do deliver on the hopes, the expectations, the aspirations that have been laid out in the new UK Rare Disease Framework. Thank you very much for listening.